So I'm writing a book on the entire history of Islam, and I want to show you what chapters are going to be in that book. So to start off with the book, we have a prelude that will explain the history of Islam through the teachings of the Quran and Sunnah. These are just brief explanations that Adam alayhi salam was the first prophet and that many prophets had been sent to this earth, each teaching Tawheed, the religion of Allah, and that there is no God except for Him. But that over time, people have corrupted this religion and they divided themselves into their own sects and shirk beliefs. But after this brief introduction, I go into a full chapter on the entire history of Bani Israel, and then a second chapter on the history of Bani Ismail. These two chapters are dedicated to the two sons of Ibrahim alayhi salam and the nations that came from them. After that, there are two chapters dedicated to the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the seerah of Mecca and then the seerah of Medina. And then there's a chapter on the Khulafa ar-Rashidun, all five of them. I consider Hassan to be the fifth Khalifa. Then there's the Umayyad kingdom, and then there's a chapter on Al-Andalus, which I consider to be a continuation of the Umayyad kingdom. Of course, until the various conquests by the Moroccan kingdoms after. Then we'll return back to the Middle East with the Abbasid kingdom, which will be an absolutely huge chapter, probably the longest chapter in the book. I might actually need to split this chapter into two pieces, but I haven't yet decided if I'm going to do that. And then after that, I'm going to have the chapter called The Rise of the Turks. These were when the Turks became Muslim, they started to come into the Middle East, and this led to kingdoms such as the Seljuks and the Rum Sultanate in modern-day Turkey. And this is actually the first time that the Muslims were able to conquer and hold this area called Anatolia, this area of Turkey. And this chapter will also include the events of the Zengids and Salah ad-Din and their struggle against the Fatimids in Egypt and the Crusaders in Palestine. I may also include the Mamluks and the Mongol invasions in this chapter as well, but if it gets too long, I'll have to split the chapter into two pieces and put those in a second part. And I'll probably write this chapter up until the peak of Ottoman history, which is around the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, often considered, and I'll save their downfall for a later chapter in the book. From there, we're going to move on to the next chapter where I'm catching up on all the history that's happened in India. This is because the story of Islam in India really picks up after the rise of the Turks. This is when you have the Ghurids and the Delhi Sultanate, and of course the great Mughals. After that, we're going to move on to China, which has its own chapter, because the history of Islam in China is absolutely huge. It started long before the Mongol invasions, but it was the Mongol invasions that, surprisingly enough, really enhanced the presence of Islam in China. So I'll have to dedicate an entire chapter to just China. After China, we'll move on to Southeast Asia, because this region is directly connected to the history of Islam in China. Many Chinese Muslim scholars traveled to give dawah in Malaysia and Indonesia and the Philippines even, and sailors like Zheng He settled huge communities of Muslims in these lands to help spread the message of Islam. Once we're done with that region, we're going to go all the way to Africa, and we have one chapter dedicated to East Africa and another chapter dedicated to West Africa. These two parts of the continent have a very different history with Islam, and there were huge Muslim empires in both of these lands, such as the Adil Sultanate in Somalia and the Malian Empire in West Africa. Now, after these chapters, this is where we begin to see a downfall in Muslim power, as I dedicate an entire chapter to the colonization of the Muslim world. And so this starts in the age of exploration in the 1500s, and it ends with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the dissolution of the caliphate. And it just so happens that around this time, nearly all Muslim lands are conquered in one way or another. Central Asia was conquered by the Russian Empire, which later became the Soviet Union. The Muslims of China were conquered by the communists. The Indian Muslims were colonized, of course, by the British, and Africa was divided amongst the European powers. And of course, there was the colonization of the Middle East. And finally, a colony which still remains today, Palestine. Then I'll have a chapter on the end of the European empires and the independence of each Muslim nation. And all of the major events leading up to our world today, of course. Finally, I'll have a chapter dedicated to the New World. This is the Americas and Australia and the Caribbean and New Zealand. You'd be very surprised at how much history there is, Muslim history, in these places. And it all leads up to the arrival of Malcolm X and the hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million Muslim reverts to Islam today who converted because of his preaching. These predictions will come as a small section at the very end of the book, and it's going to analyze the history of Islam that we've already seen and try to see how these same patterns are going to reappear in the New World and in the future nations, perhaps how the European nations or how the Americas are going to be Muslim, how long it might take, considering we know how long it took other nations to become Muslims, like Malaysia and Indonesia. And so that will be the sort of the last section of the book. I might also have a glossary at the end. Maybe I'll add some important maps at the end, or even at the beginning. I'm not sure. And any other sort of pages or sections that are important to have like a full understanding. Maybe I'll have a timeline of the entire history of Islam on like a 1-page spread, either at the beginning or the end, so that you can see everything in one place. And that's it. That's the entire history of Islam in one book. And so if this book interests you, go to my website now and pre-order it. I will literally write your name in the book so that people see it hundreds of years later, so that they know that you are one of the original backers in this project. May Allah grant you a legacy in which your name is remembered forever.